One of the examples, and I mentioned I wanted to talk to you about this, one of the examples of how perverse the conversation has gotten about this is in the conversation on human rights. Human rights has, believe it or not, become something that's difficult to define. Can you believe it? The right to have human autonomy, self-rule, choice of free-thinking individuals to choose which parts of the faith they practice, what they say, what they do. That freedom, as being an essential universal human rights, should be blind to religion, should not in any way be dominated by one religion knowing more than the other. And yet what the Islamists have done, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out, then in 1991 they came out with the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, which they determine is not universal, but is unique to Islam. And as a result of being unique to Islam, following from that is a doctrine of Sharia, a doctrine of Islamic law that encumbers with it a lack of choice because it is God's law, and from that lack of choice comes singular interpretations that are dominated by ulama or scholars who have written texts on schools of thinking. In the Sunni, it's Shafi'i, Hanafi, Hanbali, and Maliki schools of thought, and in the Shia, it is the Ja'fari and Khomeinists and other schools of thought. That's the divisions as we see them. And now this is all intentional. In the early 90s, as the OIC came out with its Cairo Declaration on Human Rights, and by the way, they don't even like that term human rights, which is the main point that I want to bring to you today. They also started to develop that term Islamophobia, and we'll talk about that again. I've talked about it before. Islamophobia is a term used to denote here in America the concept of what they mean is when they're talking to non-Muslims, they say you're Islamophobic, meaning that you are a bigot against Muslims. But bigotry is a form of hatred against a specific race or faith group. Anti-Semitism is hate against Jewish people. It's not called Judeophobia. The reason the Islamists called it Islamophobia is because they want to make synonymous criticisms of Islam with criticisms of Muslims and hate of Muslims. They want to make the ideas of Islam anthropomorphized into being human so that you can't criticize ideas. And that's why our Muslim Reform movement says ideas don't have rights, human beings do, and that undercuts the very concept of even the use of the term Islamophobia, which I reject. But let's get to this term, human rights. It's no doubt that now into the 21st century, it stands to reason that the Islamists don't want us. They say, oh, we won't even listen to anyone who talks about human rights. And now the State Department has made part of its entire mantra that they want to prevent the loss of an engagement and conversation of various Islamic groups because they don't really want to westernize the conversation into using terms like human rights. So therefore they'll use other terms about compassion, about anti-terrorism, about tolerance. Those are facades in an Orwellian fashion to prevent the conversation about human rights. Universal human rights that every human being understands are part and parcel of the equality of every individual. The hallmark. It should stand to reason that the only groups offended or repulsed by using the term human rights are going to be those who stand the most to lose by its defense. The Islamist establishment, tyrants, and the totalitarian governments across the Muslim majority world. The hallmark of these Orwellian zealots is the control of language. As I mentioned in Islamophobia, they want to control the language. When you talk human rights, you have to talk about human beings. They want to dismiss that as Western, when in fact it is very human. The people, if the language was so bad to use and makes people turn off, why are the signs in the streets of the thousands in Tehran and Qom and Cairo about their human rights, about their freedoms, about their liberty, about their right to economic individuality? Why is that? The people aren't afraid of those words. The only people afraid of those words are the tyrant, the tribal warlords, the leaders, the king of Saudi Arabia and his spoon-fed, silver spoon-fed princes, the king of Dubai and of Qatar and all of these countries that they want to dominate which rights their citizens get, the slaves of their states get, rather than treat them as equal human beings. And if they did, they'd have to recognize human rights. The only way forward for their citizens, the human beings of those nations, is revolutions. The only way they're going to get their human rights recognized is revolutions, and we in the West have an obligation morally to use the language of human rights, because that's the language the people want to use, because that's their right, inalienable from God. Now, the Islamists think they're God. The Islamists think that, well, if God wanted to talk human rights, he would have used those terms in the Quran. And we can have a theological discussion, and we will on this program. I'll talk to you about various rights as they're discussed in the Quran. And on our homepage at AIF Democracy, we have the passage that we should speak for justice, stand for justice, even if it be against our own kin. To me, that's a statement of human rights. Or the statement in the Quran that God will not help a people unless they help themselves first, unless they treat their own maladies first. That's about individual rights, rugged individualism. And you need only look at the writings, the books, the reformers, the free thinkers, the prisoners of conscience. See what they write. And if you think the people of the Middle East don't want to use the term human rights, they do. It is the Islamists, the Hamases of the world that don't want you to use that term, because they know they will lose the debate about their so-called group rights, the collective identity movements of Islamist rights. They'll lose that if we start talking about individual human rights. The future of American interests, human interests, and the interests of freedom and liberty are going to be with those with the courage and the bravery to use that human rights language, as we saw in the Arab awakening in 2011. The side might now, if we defend those on the streets, it might end up with anarchy, it might end up with more chaos, but at the end of the day, that is the right way, and it is the only way forward, other than continuing to reproduce the same errors of the 20th century and from the 13th century and even from the 8th century. The youth movements, the anti-tyranny movements are about human rights. So use those words. Hang on to those languages. Don't allow the language of truth that comes out of our mouth to change because we think that it's all about being at the table. As the president reiterated at the State of the Union this week, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was stating the obvious. For decades, we've ignored the obvious because we thought it would make them not come to the table, when in fact their militant veto prevented them from being treated like adults and having to come to terms with genuine criticism and genuine equality. And that's one example. And there's tons and tons of others.